Welcome, everyone, to Everyday Therapy, a podcast with the goal of empowering you to become the best version of yourself. We hope to meet you wherever you may be on your journey to mental health. My name is Krista Overson. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical site director, and I'm joined by the very excellent Brett Cushing, my co-host, who's also a licensed therapist and clinical site director. This is the official podcast of Nystrom & Associates, one of the largest behavioral health companies in the country. If you or someone you love is struggling with their mental health, Nystrom has over 50 clinics with dedicated helpers. Visit us at nystromcounseling.com. So today, we're starting off with an exciting story, but there's a reason. Because we're going to talk about trauma today. And part of talking about trauma is telling what is considered to be like a traumatic experience.
Right, because some people really disagree.
Yes.
That's not really that traumatic. And it really lies in, kind of like beauty. Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, right? And so trauma is kind of like that.
Trauma's like that. And I'm glad you said that because I want to give a caveat. I'm going to share a story that happened in my family several years ago, but I want to say that this example is for illustrative purposes, and it does not mean that this is the one be-all and end-all definition of what is a trauma, right? Mm-hmm. Trauma can be very subtle. It can be more extreme. But today we're going to talk about how the mailman saved my house from burning down when I was in, maybe 8th or 9th grade.
Wow.
So I'll set the scene. My younger sister, who's 3 years younger than me, was in about 6th grade, I think, 5th or 6th grade. And she got home from school first. My parents were at work, and me and my sisters would get home from school, fix an after-school snack. So my sister started fixing herself, I think, some Eggos, like waffles, in the toaster. And you know those bags of cereal?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Marshmallow Mateys or whatever.
Good stuff.
So there was a bag of cereal that accidentally got draped over the toaster.
I knew it was going to involve the toaster.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she's minding her own business. She's the only one home. You know, I'm not far behind, but I'm at a different school, so my day's a little longer. So she, minding her own business, all of a sudden she starts to smell smoke. And of course, the toaster has caught fire because of this plastic cereal bag that's draped over the top. Well, right above the toaster is a cupboard, wooden cabinets and cupboards. And so the whole thing goes up in flames.
Wow.
So like half the kitchen is now up in flames. So my sister, of course, panics and is like kind of trying to figure out what to do. She now admits she's like, if I could do it all over again, I would not do what I did.
Sure.
But again, she was a kid, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
It's like we go into this state of mind where it's like, why did I do that? Yeah. So she called my mom at work first. And, you know, of course, anyone listening is going to be like, call 911. But
call your mom. Hey,
my mom wasn't available. And so the doorbell rang. And my sister came to get the door, and she needed to sign for a package. It's the mailman. And she says, I think she said something to him like, can you help me? My house, my kitchen is burning. Like, my kitchen's on fire. And he, like, without missing a beat, comes in, wets down a towel, and, like, puts it out.
Just like that.
And then, of course, you know, they call it, like, by then 911's on the way and all these things. And so I come home to like fire trucks outside the house.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different things to this, but to this day, my sister is nervous about fire. And this is a situation where, of course, like, you know, there was a hero that saved the day and all of that. But, yeah, I think it's a good example of...
Well, sure, because I'm sure there are people, understandably, that could listen to this and sort of conclude, well, I mean, everything was fine, so what's the big deal? I mean, I can see if the house went up, but it went out, mailman was there, special delivery, puts out the fire.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. I think so go ahead, you were saying.
Yeah, so like, I could hear some people sort of saying, well, come on. Like, that's not trauma. Trauma is going to war.
Mm-hmm.
So how can this be trauma and going to war be trauma? You know?
Right. Yep.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what's important is when we think about trauma, there's a few different ways that this can go.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you can experience a traumatic event directly, or you can hear about a trauma or about a situation. So I think the key here in this story is for my sister to be exposed to actual or threatened death or serious injury.
Yes.
So in the moments, what's good to pay attention to is in the moments when she was assessing the situation, there's a fire burning, you know, she's not sure what's going to happen next. She's kind of trying to figure out what's going on. Like the threat to her physical integrity and the home, right? I think that is where our brain does a special thing for us where it captures that moment in time and it puts it away and can...
Well, I think with the threat comes the sense of powerlessness.
Yes.
And so whether it's on a battlefield or in your kitchen as a sixth grader with the house going up in flames, there's a threat.
Yep.
It's imminent and it's perceived, and there's a sense of powerlessness that goes along with that.
Right.
And so if you're feeling powerless and there's a threat, you feel powerless and there's a threat no matter the situation or circumstance.
Right.
The mailman probably didn't feel that because the mailman didn't see it as much of a threat. The mailman was older, had more resources, cognitive faculties, maybe experience, and not a problem.
Yeah.
But that's what we run into, I think, is we just judge other people.
Yeah.
And we think, well, what's wrong with them?
Yeah.
Instead of thinking like, well, look what happened to them, how they experienced this.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And just because someone experiences a traumatic event doesn't mean that it'll necessarily turn into a trauma-related disorder.
That's
right?
True.
So this is a situation where it could go one way or the other, right? For my sister specifically, right? So.
Now, interestingly, because I was a police chaplain for many years and been on the scene of fires and like pretty much just about everything you can think of, and a lot of horrific things. And it can be like super traumatic for some people, not as much for others, depending on how we're perceiving it. There is something called critical incident stress management, debriefing. And what they found in some of the research there is the sooner someone's able to talk about a traumatic event in relation to when it happened, and then the more frequently they talk about it after it happened, the less impact it has. And so, conversely, people don't talk about it after it happens.
Right.
It tends to have a greater effect. We're suppressing it, and then things we suppress find a way to come out. So, super important to have that.
Now, another piece of it too is, like you said, I'm not sure what kind of discussion there was after the fire. Like, you know, I'm not sure if my sister was able to talk with my parents about it or process it or anything. And then, you know, you have another situation of like, what if, I don't think this happened in our case, but, you know, parents could come home and berate you, you know, like, again, if you're in a family where there's some level of emotional abuse or shame or whatever, it's like, what were you thinking? How could you let this happen? And again, I don't think that's what happened for my sister, but like she still even had some shame about the fact that she didn't call 911 right away.
Sure.
Right? Yes. And she called my mom, you know? And so I think there's a lot of different pieces to it.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you mentioned that because that is part of our response to this that really gives so much more power to the event is that sense of shame. Shooting on ourselves, like I should have done more, I didn't do all that I could. So we have this not only intense fear and this helplessness or powerlessness, but there's horror, there's attachment to it, and I think that shame is part of that attachment to the event, that I have so much shame over what happened and I should have done more. So those are very common responses, and I think we're really trying to help people understand that this is exposure. Trauma is exposure. To repetitive or severe events. So that could be child abuse that happens over a course of time. Could be one time too. So that can cause a severe and lasting effect on somebody. So it can also occur from neglect.
Now, this is fascinating. So let's talk about this, because I think this is one of the biggest misunderstandings that people have about trauma, right? Mm-hmm. So I could hear someone say, so how can neglect be traumatic? Because it's a lack of something. It's not something directly necessarily happening to me.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that's such a really good point, because neglect just seems like a sin of omission, so to speak.
Right.
And so nothing really happened to you.
Yeah.
But that's the point.
Yeah, nothing happened.
Happened for you.
For you.
Yes.
Right.
And that can send people into that sense of powerlessness, especially as a kid being neglected. That would be an interesting topic to do sometime. Mm-hmm. The effect of neglect.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, that rhymes.
The effect of neglect.
Yeah, well, there we go.
So, and neglect could be, I mean, if we're going to look at that a little bit, that's the absence of like essential physical or emotional care. So like never having hugs, never having any physical touch, right? Growing up, not having, I think even like having your caregivers pay attention to you. Like, yes, they're paying attention as in they're making sure you're safe and you're not getting, falling off the deck or whatever, but like, but paying attention to like your inner experience.
Yeah.
And like, coming home from school, like, tell me about your day. Like, I think there's a lot that can go into that.
There
right?
is. Yeah. I'm really glad you paused on that to talk about the neglect effect. And that is pretty powerful. But also, do you ever notice, and it's true, like there's a difference of how much an event can affect people. And so I find the level of attachment and our sense of attachment really affects how much and how profoundly affected we're going to be by trauma. And so that's why I think with natural disasters, that's very traumatic for people. Sense of security and safety is just lost because of this natural event. Whereas interpersonal violence that happens to people, physical, emotional, sexual violence and abuse that happens, that has typically a much more profound effect upon people because that sense of attachment is stronger with this person. Like I trusted this person.
Oh, right.
I don't trust nature as much, as I do this person. And that's true. Like for people who have had like sexual abuse, it has a more profound effect if it's coming on somebody who had a greater sense of security and trust than if it happened by a stranger.
Right.
So interpersonal violence tends to be more traumatic than like natural disasters. And it's typically experienced then as intentional when it's happening.
Right.
Rather than as like an accident.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. So we've spoken to a few different things that could be considered trauma, right? So we have both personal and private experiences, such as assault, sexual abuse, interpersonal violence. Those would be maybe like more personal. And then there's the public. So natural disasters, you had mentioned war earlier, community violence. But I think what it comes down to is whether it's public, private, or personal, it's the perception of an event or a situation that varies so widely, and why it's hard to define trauma, because it all depends on everything you've been through in your life up to that point is going to kind of affect how this incident happened.
And I appreciate that. A lot of people, I hear people talk a lot about it's the perception. It's not only the perception; it's the meaning of that perception. A lot of times, it's I'm powerless, I'm helpless, I should have done more. This perception of oneself, but it's the meaning that we attach to it.
Exactly.
And that really drives it for us. I don't want to forget either. We did an episode probably a year or so, more than a year ago, Vicky, A Story of Hope, which is a great example. She talked a lot about trauma in her life, and I really want to encourage people to go back and listen to that one. And forecasting, we're going to have another client be coming on talking about sexual trauma in the weeks ahead.
Sure.
And provide a little more enlightenment there.
Nice. Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. So I think you were saying it's the meaning that we make out of these experiences, right?
Yes.
So I always try to explain to people that, especially the younger we are, whatever event that we might experience, our brain is trying to attach a belief or a meaning to it to make sense of it.
Yes.
And the younger we are, the more black and white our thinking can be. Yeah. So then the events that happen to us, we tend to categorize in these very rigid categories. Mm-hmm. And usually we conclude it's something wrong with us is why something happened. So, and that has huge implications, right?
Yeah, that sticks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we it's hard to sort of rationalize our way out of that. Say, oh, well, clearly,
right?
I didn't have any control over that. So right. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's super powerful. And I've heard this too by a man, Dan Allender, I think is his name. I heard him speak once. He's written a couple of books. Wounded Heart, I think it is. But he had mentioned this too as a survivor of sexual abuse.
Okay.
I remember him saying, we also hold on to this belief that it was my fault, because what's scarier? To conclude that this was my fault that this happened, or I had no control over this and it still happened to me.
Such a great point.
I never forgot that. That was so profound to me that's kind of mitigates a little bit of the fear and vulnerability is to conclude that this was my fault. At least I had some element of control over what happened to me, as opposed to concluding, this has happened.
And so I want to expand on that a little. That's such a great point. I think the next layer of that is, especially if something happens to us at the hands of our caregivers, we are not going to blame our caregivers. We're going to blame ourselves first. Because our caregivers, in our innocence, right?
Yes.
We see them as the be-all and end-all higher power of our life because our survival depends on them. Mm-hmm. So we're going to attribute blame to ourselves. And it wouldn't I think a lot of times it just doesn't occur to us to blame our caregivers. And they make mistakes, but we don't know that when we're young, right?
Well, and what if I do conclude it's my caregiver? Then what?
Then what?
I don't have a caregiver.
Terrifying.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So another reason why we're likely to blame ourselves.
So we're talking about perception of trauma, and perception of events is what kind of contributes to something being traumatic. Let's talk about prevalence of trauma, because this is where I think people listening, hopefully they're realizing, wow, maybe it's more than just what I thought. And so I think when you hear this, I think people will realize to be human in living in this world is to experience trauma, very likely. So, for instance, back a study done in 2013, there was a report, or what they found is a report of child abuses made every 10 seconds in the United States.
Wow. That's pretty frequently.
That's pretty sobering.
Yep. There's also a stat that children who experience child abuse and neglect are much more likely to be arrested as a juvenile. And so 59% more likely to be arrested as a juvenile, 28% more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 30% more likely to commit violent crime. That's staggering. And that was a 2006 study.
Yes. Also in 2009, trauma histories are pervasive among youth in America, especially youth from diverse cultural backgrounds.
Okay.
And children with disabilities are more likely to experience neglect than children without disabilities, something we don't think about. We often think people who have disabilities, that might be traumatic enough, but part of living with that is this ongoing sense of vulnerability that people could take advantage of.
Yep. And when we think about assault, sexual assault, physical violence, there's a stat about 1 in 3 women and more than 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced physical violence, rape, and or stalking by an intimate partner. So that was as of the CDC in 2013.
1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men.
Yeah.
And I remember talking once about domestic violence, I think, here on the podcast, that I think it's 1 in 3 women have experienced domestic violence and 1 in 9 men, too.
Wow.
So as we're going through, the numbers add up. This is a tough world to live in.
It is. Yep.
Do you have any more?
I would say there's we talked about substance abuse recently.
Yeah.
75% of women and men in treatment for substance abuse report having a trauma history.
Yeah.
And that doesn't surprise me because I think we'll find that one of the ways that people try to cope with trauma is to turn to substances or addictions.
Yeah, self-medication.
Self-medication, exactly.
Going to medicate that. And that's, I'm glad you brought that up too, because when we talked about substance use, and we're going to be talking more about that in the future, with substance abuse, I was mentioning that people kind of get sober, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's usually something beneath the surface that was leading to that need to be self-medicated. And like you just said,
right?
What was it, like 75% of women and men in treatment for substance use have reported trauma histories? Wow.
Yeah, I would bet it's more than that, but that was the report.
Yeah.
So what is the impact, do you think, with trauma?
Well, it's pervasive. I think, it can be pervasive. The way I look at it in a general sense is we have this history, and then what happens is it sort of invades our lives in various ways, and then we try to avoid it in various ways, and then it also kind of just, more like that invasive part. And we just have these startled responses. We become very hypervigilant, kind of scanning rooms, and we don't realize we're always looking. I think sometimes what we can do is we overcompensate for the lack of control we felt, and then we become very controlling kind of peoples. And so it can be very pervasive for people. It's not sort of like, this just comes up once in a while. It's very pervasive.
Right, and there's a brain basis for that. So I think when we've experienced a traumatic event, there's a special part of our brain that's responsible for keeping us safe. And that part of the brain can get, activated more easily depending on what we've been through. And it puts us into these fight or flight responses, right? So you hear about fight, flight, freeze, and then another one is fawn, but it's also, submit or kind of like
appease.
Placating. Appeasing. Yep, which I think is so fascinating. But when those things are happening, our brain is sort of shutting down our non-essential tasks. And it's harder to have rational thought at that time. It's a different part. I always tell my clients it's a different part of your brain that gets activated than when you're having a traumatic response to when you're reliving a trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad because that really highlights that we can't just get over it.
Exactly.
There's a part of the brain that has been affected. Yes. You think of people who have a traumatic brain injury and you think, well, I just have to adjust my expectations. They can't do certain things.
Yep.
And I'm not saying this is a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. I'm saying that to underscore your point, this affects the brain and the way the brain operates. And that's why it's all the more crucial for us to move to a perspective in life, to have what we call a trauma-informed perspective, where we move from looking at people in this world where trauma occurs quite often, and move away from critical judgment and asking ourselves, what's wrong with that person, to I wonder what happened to them.
Yep.
And noticing that, the trauma, it happens.
Yep.
And it's not like we're just trying to slap a label and say, well, I've got trauma and, everyone sort of be careful with me because I have trauma. We're not trying to fragilize people either. We're trying to say, this has a huge effect on people. And when people try to overcome it, it can be ways that are very effective. It can be oftentimes very ineffective ways.
Right.
And it gets in the way. But it requires a ton of courage and a lot of work to work through it.
Right.
And you can work through it.
I try to use analogies like a car alarm. Yes. So if you think about how, a lot of cars these days have alarm systems that go off. And so our body and our brain has a similar thing that can get sort of confused when we've been through a traumatic event. So imagine a car alarm that, it goes off when there's real danger, but it also goes off when it sees, something that resembles danger, even just very slightly. Almost like it goes off maybe too often. It doesn't go off often enough.
Yes.
It's like, think about kind of this hardwiring of an alarm system that it's got some it's like over functioning.
Yes. Well, think about that. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's such a great analogy, and maybe we'll kind of be closing this out here and pick up again. But when we think about trauma and trying to move from that perspective of what's wrong with them, what's their problem, to I wonder what happened to them.
Yeah.
We all know what it's like to hear a car alarm going off.
Yeah.
Like, man, that is so annoying. Why is somebody ever going to turn that off? And then somebody turns it off. Okay.
Great.
Fine. But that doesn't happen very often.
Mm-hmm.
But when you've experienced that, you've experienced trauma, it's like a car alarm going off constantly in your body, and seemingly for no apparent reason. And imagine how annoying and how intrusive that is to somebody. And they can't help it.
Yep.
And they can't just click a button to turn it off, and they go through life like that day in and day out.
Well, and now we can weave in again about addiction, because think about if you have an alarm system that's going off like that willy-nilly, and it's unclear to you why or what's going on, how easy is it you find a substance or a behavior that shuts it off? So it's like, you've got your key fob and you just hit a button to turn off the car alarm.
Yeah.
So that's how addiction can be. It's like, when I go into fight or flight, if I take a drink or take a shot or whatever it is, I'm suddenly no longer feeling that way. But it doesn't fix the root cause.
Right. It works. That's the problem.
Exactly.
It works really
too
does
well.
Work.
Yeah.
And it works very immediately, which is what we're seeking.
Yes.
And think of that relief when you're listening to someone's car alarm go off. And you're like, car alarm, that's kind of funny. And then after about 15 seconds,
you're like, okay, now it's annoying.
Yeah, all right. Is anybody going to turn this off? And then it's going on for even a minute, and now it's intolerable.
Yep.
And would somebody please? And all it takes is that click a button. Yep. And then you sort of hear this collective sigh of relief from everybody, like, oh, wow, that was really annoying.
Yeah.
And so we know what that's like for us. Mm-hmm. And how much more compassion can we have towards somebody when that's what they're living with every day, not knowing when it's going to go off again, not knowing when it's going to stop or how to stop it. Mm-hmm. That's quite miserable.
Yep. The other thing I'll just highlight before we wrap up today is so kind of having an easy startle or an easy kind of fight or flight trigger.
Yes.
The other things that you might notice with trauma is an avoidance pattern. Mm-hmm. So sometimes when people are telling me about symptoms or like things they experience, I'm listening for what are the things that they won't do. Like, what are the things in their life they refuse to address or look at? Mm-hmm. So it's not so much about, they might not even see it that way.
Yeah.
But like, again, someone who's never had any sort of close relationships, right? It's like, okay, what's going on there? Because there's possibly an avoidance there of like, I learned early on that people are going to hurt me. So I'm just not going to get close. And they may not see that as like a symptom of trauma, right? But I think it really can be. So,
yeah, it definitely can be.
Yep.
Well, I think as we wrap up, one of my hopes is that people, I think, listen to this and realize, trauma is a normative way of going through life. You're likely to experience some level of trauma.
Yep.
And so, to sort of normalize it without minimizing it and its effect, but hopefully drawing more attention to how much this really invades and impedes the quality of life for people. Mm-hmm. And for others of us, we might have someone close to us, a partner, a spouse, a kid, a sibling, a parent, who have gone through some trauma, and we're sort of maybe vaguely aware. My hope is that as you're listening to this, your response to them can maybe shift to a greater intensity of compassion and maybe away from just sort of tolerating it or just be like, I know there was some trauma there in that person's life, and it probably affects them, just sort of moving away from indifference to a greater sense of real compassion and truly moving towards the person to try to understand more and enter into their pain with them, because it's also with that shame, it's so isolating too.
It's very isolating. Great point. Well, we hope this has been a helpful overview to start us off on the topic of trauma. Everybody take good care, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.